I can think of no better words with which to start this evening's lecture than Sholem Aleichem. A very warm welcome to the Kadar family, and special thanks to Avraham Kadar and to the entire family, to the Naomi Kadar Foundation for making this evening possible, for providing that beautiful reception, which at least one person told me he thought was the best reception he's ever been to. So we're off to a good start. If there are any members of the family of Sholem Aleichem in our audience, please stand up and announce yourselves. I would like to acknowledge the fact that three of our of YIVO's trustees are with us this evening. Our co-chairman Ruth Levine, Irene Pletka, and Chava Lapin. It's a very, very special occasion, this annual lecture sponsored by the Naomi Foundation on the subject of Yiddish language and linguistics, and we are deeply, deeply grateful to the generosity and vision of the foundation for making it possible. Thank you again. I want to note that our lecturer this evening, Jeremy Dauber, as many of you know, has written a very fine biography of Sholem Aleichem. And if you wish to make a gift membership to YIVO for $100, you will receive as our gift a signed copy of this very fine biography. So think about it. YIVO is involved in many, many wonderful projects around the world today. We have an educational online program that is being attended by people in Moscow, in Paris, in London, in Beijing, in Uganda, in Uruguay, and even in the state of Idaho. And what is obvious to us is that Yiddishkeit, the culture of our people of Eastern Europe and Russia, is something to which we and our children, not just our parents and our grandparents, are still very, very intimately tied and connected to. We have begun, as many of you know, this vast project actually to preserve and to digitize and to present to the entire world eventually what we call our YIVO Vilna collections. These are collections. This is a collection of approximately 1 million documents and some 12,000 books that were originally housed in the YIVO Institute in Vilna, that were stolen by the Nazis, sent to Frankfurt, recovered by the U.S. Army, and eventually sent back here to New York City. Another part of the same collection stayed in Lithuania, where it had been hidden in bunkers during the Holocaust, where it had been given to non-Jewish friends, and some of it was hidden underground. And at the end of the war, Avram Sutzkever and other leaders of the YIVO Institute who had survived came back to Vilnius, now Vilnius, then Vilna, Vilno for some of us. And they recovered as much of this as they possibly could. In 1948, the Soviet Union, which had made Lithuania a satellite, declared that all Jewish material was to be destroyed. And these objects that had already endured the Holocaust had to be saved a second time. And miraculously, a Lithuanian librarian who was also a member of the Red Army, Antanas Ulpis, came forward secretly, and with a select group of colleagues, he saved this material and he hid it in the basement, the main part of it, in the basement of a Catholic church, St. George's Church, where it stayed unknown to the world from 1948 to 1988. He died in 1987, never knowing what was to become of these materials. In 1988, when Lithuania declared independence, 89, the Lithuanian government announced that it had these materials. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the government said that it had found an additional cache of documents as well. And from 1991 to the present, to 2013, there was a bit of a struggle over who owned this material, but we decided to put the question of ownership aside and work together with the Lithuanians to preserve everything, to digitize everything, to reunite these fragments of a shattered Jewish experience. Literally, we have documents here in New York, part of which are here and part of which reside today in Vilnius, Lithuania. And to set aside our differences and instead digitize these materials. And in a few years more, we will have digitized everything, and we will have created a website to make these materials available to the Jewish people worldwide. These materials are in Yiddish, they're in Polish, they're in Russian, German, many, many different languages. It's a vast project. There are brochures about it. We invite your interest and your generosity. As of now, it is approximately 90% funded, but we still need your generous donations. And now, I would like to introduce Lindsay Bodner from the Kadar Family Foundation, who will introduce Jeremy Dauber and the rest of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and I want to thank everyone at YIVO for making this event possible, and especially Jonathan for making this partnership between the Naomi Foundation and YIVO possible. Thank you to Alex Wieser, thank you to David Haskell, and again, everyone at YIVO who's been so terrific, especially Eddie Portnoy for the wonderful tour that we took earlier. So my name is Lindsay Bodner, and I'm the Executive Director of the Naomi Foundation. I want to welcome everybody here on behalf of the Foundation Board, the Kadar family, Dr. Avram Kadar, Maya Kadar-Kowalski, Nadav Kadar, and Einat Kadar. We're very fortunate today to be joined by several members of the Kadar family, including Naomi's 3 children, Maya, Nadav, and Einat, and Naomi's sister, Renee, and several other close family members. We're so glad that you're here today. The Naomi Foundation started over 6 years ago, to honor the memory of Naomi Prawer Kadar, an extraordinary person. She was a lifelong educator, a Yiddish scholar and teacher, and Naomi loved teaching Yiddish. She taught Yiddish all around the world, including at Tel Aviv University, at Columbia, in Brussels, at JTS, and of course, here at YIVO. She received her PhD from Columbia after writing her dissertation in Yiddish children's literature. With the help of a truly talented and extraordinary editor, Bani Fetterman, Brandeis University Press will be publishing Naomi's book called Raising Secular Jews, Yiddish Schools and Their Periodicals for Children this fall. Yeah. Yiddish was Naomi's lifelong passion. And Naomi, who was a tremendous educator and pedagogy expert, as a teacher, she strove to make sure that every student of hers was able to reach their potential. With Naomi's values and following her example, the Naomi Foundation seeks to reimagine education. We work in the innovative education sphere to train teachers and make significant system-wide change. We make grants and create partnerships in 3 areas. We drive change in the education sector through teacher empowerment and training. We support scientific and medical research, and we shepherd Yiddish in academic settings with the hope of making this rich, vibrant, beautiful language come alive for a new generation of scholars and learners. Tonight, we're here to celebrate Yiddish. There are a few more appropriate ways to celebrate the language than hearing about one of the Yiddish language's greatest authors and playwrights, and certainly its most famous, Sholem Aleichem. And there's perhaps no one more qualified to speak about this legend of a man than Professor Jeremy Dauber. Professor Dauber is the Atron Professor of Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture at Columbia University, where he also serves as director of its Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies and teaches in the American Studies program. He graduated summa cum laude from Harvard and received his doctorate from the University of Oxford, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. His previous books include In the Demon's Bedroom, Yiddish Literature and the Early Modern, Antonio's Devils, Writers of the Jewish Enlightenment and Birth of Modern Hebrew and Yiddish Literature, and his latest book, which we will hopefully get some insight into tonight, is The Worlds of Sholem Aleichem, a biography, published by Schocken. This book was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award and a recipient of the Sophie Brody Honor Medal from the American Library Association. He frequently lectures on topics related to Jewish history, literature, humor, and popular culture at the 92nd Street Y and other venues throughout the United States. Professor Dauber's next book, A History of Jewish Comedy, will be published by Norton in the fall of 2017. So, in addition to these tremendous professional accomplishments, Professor Dauber was also a colleague and mentor of Naomi and a friend of the Kadar family. So tonight has great personal significance for the family and the foundation. Naomi certainly would have enjoyed attending tonight's lecture and hearing from Professor Dauber about his fascinating insights into what it takes to be the biographer of a Yiddish legend. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Professor Jeremy Dauber.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. There was some discussion in our private tour whether or not I would thank Lindsay for her introduction or not. I'm pleased to say that I'm going to thank her very much. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you to Eddie for that same private tour. Thank you so much, Jonathan, and everyone else at YIVO for their warm welcome and their support of so much related not only, of course, to Sholem Aleichem, but to Yiddish culture in its entirety. And thank you to my teachers, some of whom are here, who I hope will be kind in my grading after the performance. Most of all, though, I would like to thank the Kadar family for their generosity in many areas, in many fields, but particularly, of course, in their commitment to Yiddish language and culture, for doing so much to honor Naomi, an extraordinary lover, as Lindsay has just said, of Yiddish language and culture and literature. Lindsay described me as a teacher or a mentor to Naomi, but I think that really the truth is that it was the other way around. I remember very clearly arriving on Morningside Heights now 17 years ago, the ink drying on my diploma, and wondering how this whole business was going to work out. And Naomi's gracious presence, her warmth, her capacity to listen to someone, a tyro in the business, to hear, shined through all of our encounters, as did her love of family, of her own family and the family that she made at Columbia. All of those things I remember on a regular and constant basis, and I'm so honored to be able to honor her here tonight with my poor words. I think that many of the capacities that I've just described that characterize Naomi so well also actually describe Sholem Aleichem. I don't recall ever speaking about Sholem Aleichem with Naomi, but I think that they are two kindred spirits, and it's a fitting tribute, I hope, to discuss another beloved figure, Sholem Aleichem, tonight, who is also celebrating a kind of memorial. It is his 100th anniversary of his death. It's his 100th yard sign. And I have to start out my comments about Sholem Aleichem this evening by an apology. I suppose what would a Yiddish or a Jewish lecture be without beginning with an apology? And that is that the title of my lecture, 13 Ways of Looking at Sholem Aleichem, would probably have rubbed him slightly the wrong way. And the reason, is that Sholem Aleichem suffered from tridecaphobia, that is, a fear of the number 13, to the extent that he numbered his manuscripts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 12a, 14. Well, 12 Aleph, but you know what I mean. And so he would not have been so crazy about that. But I have to say that this was, because for me, I was influenced in starting to write Sholem Aleichem's biography by a poem by Wallace Stevens called 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. Some of you may know the poem. I learned it in school. Sholem Aleichem himself, I don't mean to imply, was a poet, or at least a poet of merit. Of all of his tremendous literary accomplishments, I think he was the first, in fact, we know he was the first to admit that his poetic accomplishments were not quite up to his otherwise high standards. But Stevens' poem always struck me as a powerful lesson for a biographer. What it did was it continued to take this one image, the blackbird, and it constantly, in 13 small little images, poetic images, a couple of lines, would constantly refract and reframe the blackbird in a way that constantly sort of shifted your perspectives. And I tried to be mindful of that because it was almost always when I started telling people in the academy, I think this is the academic version of what's your sign, right, from the 70s. People say, well, what are you working on? What are you writing? And so I would say, well, I'm writing a biography of Sholem Aleichem. They say, oh, what's your angle? And I sort of said, well, I don't know what I have one angle, right, angles. And that always struck me as quite limiting as a question, but it's an unavoidable fact of writing the biography that it is a limiting aspect. You take the multiplicity and the variety and the grandeur of a person's life, any person's life, and put it between hardcovers, available on sale now, and you necessarily limit. But I tried to say, well, maybe there are multiple ways and multiple lessons of looking at Sholem Aleichem in this way that Wallace Stevens looks at a blackbird. And I was hoping that while I told some of the story of Sholem Aleichem tonight, that I would share some of those angles, some of those particular approaches with you. Now, I don't mean to do this in a way of being precious about myself or about my process or being all writerly, but I do hope that these ways will not only bring to life Sholem Aleichem, perhaps in a slightly different way than simply a linear recitation of the facts of his life, but also to bring up and to talk about some of the questions of writing an English language literary biography of a Yiddish writer in the early 21st century. So with your indulgence, that is what I'm going to do, and I apologize that Wallace Stevens did not say that there were 7 ways of looking at a blackbird or 8 ways, but 13 it is, and there we are. So let's begin. I'm hoping to do all of this by 8:10 at the latest, so let's. I know there's a reception outside we have to get to. So let's start with at the beginning, and let's start with the way that Sholem Aleichem thought about his own writing his own life, because Sholem Aleichem did engage in an active autobiography. In fact, it is an incomplete autobiography. It was one of the last things that was on his desk as he died. But he pitched this autobiography to a potential philanthropic donor, a petroleum merchant named Shin Sharira in 1913, and he said that someone had told him that his biography is the history of our literature, and that it was also the history of a whole chain of movements. This is a quote from a letter of his. And our communal life and communal activists, Hasidism, Mitnagdim, assimilationists, nationalists, lovers of Zion, Zionists, territorialists, socialists, everything that I myself have lived through. In short, he wrote, this is not my biography, but the biography of our Yiddish world, and by necessity, my figure as a person and a writer will shine through. That is what he wrote in the letter. And the first way I think that one thinks about sometimes writing a biography of this kind of figure is one as a mirror of Jewish history, right? That is to say, here is a remarkable figure who really did it all. He really was involved in many of the movements, maybe even all of the movements, that impacted Eastern European Jewish society as it shuddered and jutted its way through modernization in the tumultuous years of the late 19th and early 20th century. And we'll talk about some of those in passing as we go on. But it was one of the reasons that made him such an engrossing figure to write about, because as he says to himself, his life makes very good copy, right? It makes very good sort of approach. He is not someone who just sits in his room and turns out pages. He seems to have been involved with the good and the great in many of these events. This kind of thing naturally, this kind of approach of Sholem Aleichem's and then indeed of mine in telling his story, naturally privileges his Jewishness, right? He says he's a mirror of Jewish history as opposed to, let's say, Russian history or American history or European history. And it also tends to make one think about writing the story as a story of representativeness. So one of the challenges I knew that one had to face was to say, how do you tell the story of Sholem Aleichem as a representative person when indeed he was not representative in any way? He was an extraordinary individual. And there may be no better proof of his extraordinariness and the extraordinary impact and influence that he had than the way that not he lived his life, but he left his life. That is to say, his funeral. And not only, he died in New York 100 years ago, as I said. He died in 1916. And there were two remarkable things about the memorial around his funeral, the parade around his funeral. The first is its sheer size. Estimates of this funeral parade, of which there are pictures in the Sholem Aleichem exhibit here at YIVO, organized by Eddie Portnoy, which we had a wonderful private tour of, but is available to anybody who wants to see it. Estimates range from 30,000 to 250,000 people. Estimation was not a great job of the American press in the 1916, but probably the number was, people think probably about 150 to 200,000, which it seems is still the largest public funeral in the history of New York City. That is one remarkable thing. But the second remarkable thing, and I think more remarkable than getting 150,000 people to turn out to something, is getting 150,000 Jews to turn out in agreement about anything, you know. And this really was the case with Sholem Aleichem, that you had Hebraists, and you had Yiddishists, and you had communists, and you had socialists, and you had Orthodox Jews, and conservative Jews, and Reform Jews, and uptown German Jews, and downtown Eastern European Jews. They all came together in admiration of this individual. And so, in some ways, Sholem Aleichem presented, and this is the second way of looking at him, a kind of model for an American Jewish identity that is multi-variegated, that is not one thing necessarily or another. That said, I want to suggest that one of the reasons that all of these people turned out is not because they were reading Sholem Aleichem then. By the time Sholem Aleichem died, he was going from place to place trying to look for people to publish his work. But in some sense, because it was a nostalgia act. It was an act of nostalgia of something that they all shared in common from their history. And in some ways, that also presents a model for a certain kind of American Jewish identity, is the relationship back and forth with one's history. You all know the phenomenon that some big popular recording artist now passes away, and their sales on their CDs, not their CDs anymore, but you know what I mean, jumps massively. Right? In some cases, Sholem Aleichem's appeal was, this was the world that had gone by. This is the world that was past. And so, one of the reasons, one of the things that helped shape the book was first to be mindful of the way that Sholem Aleichem's popularity did in fact fluctuate. One didn't want to create some kind of hagiographic material that said, well, he just started getting popular and maintained this way. That doesn't seem to have been true. But also a decision to focus on his afterlife as well. The story of how did Sholem Aleichem get to be the figure that he is today. And I'll come back to that. But that is true in a number of different venues, or a number of different forums, both in an American Jewish audience who recognizes, as Lindsay said, Sholem Aleichem's name when they often don't recognize many other Yiddish writers. It's certainly the case in the literary criticism around Yiddish writing, which early on did not necessarily think Sholem Aleichem was as accomplished a writer in some cases, and now is sort of unified largely in his literary merit. There are a number of different ways of approaching him, but I thought that focusing on the afterlife in some part was the only way to be true to the story of Sholem Aleichem, because I was writing this book now, we're reading it now, and we're grappling always with the idea of what Sholem Aleichem has become and not just who he was, while being mindful of telling the story and being honest to every moment within it. So let's start with some of those early moments within it, and Sholem Aleichem's early years in a small town, Pereyaslav, and the fact that he lived a life that is almost impossible for us to really comprehend and conceptually. Now, a life that was shaped almost entirely, by the ebbs and flows of traditional Judaism. That said, Sholem Aleichem's father, Nachum, was himself already interested in some of the waves of modernization that were beginning to make their way through Eastern Europe in the 1860s. And he was already interested in reading some of this new modern Hebrew literature. The reason that I bring this up is not just for the sake of checking off boxes about the story, but also to say that so many of the formative writers of Yiddish culture, secular Yiddish culture, modern Yiddish literature and culture, were engaged in a kind of act of rebellion with their family. They were constantly, the family was solely traditional, whatever that may mean. They were interested in other things. This caused a great deal of rift within their families, and the kind of psychic trauma that led to would then redound in the works of these writers for decades and decades on end. This was not the case with Sholem Aleichem. Sholem Aleichem's father not only loved this new Hebrew literature, but also was willing to send him to a Russian gymnasia, to a Russian school. This was largely speaking unheard of. And when young Sholem came back, and it turned out that on one of his first day of schools, there was an initiation procedure in which he was knocked to the ground and his lips were smeared with lard. It was probably the case that most people would have kicked, transfer the kid out of school right then and there. But the father did not, and Sholem Aleichem continued to have an exposure to Russian culture and literature that would serve him for the rest of his life. In that sense, Sholem Aleichem, this is our third perspective, may serve as a model for ways of trying to fuse modern life and traditional life. Maybe not the knocking down and smearing with lard part, but it certainly seems to me that Sholem Aleichem, even though as he would grow up would not live life traditionally observant, right? He loved the features of traditional Jewish life and observed them in his own ways. He was fond, for example, of Seders, of having the Passover Seder. He loved, cherished the traditional Jewish texts, particularly the Bible. These were things that he cared very deeply about, and I'll return to that later on. But that's just a way of thinking about this. Often, again, when writing biographies, people want to say, well, what's the takeaway? I often don't know what that means. The takeaway is you have the story of Sholem Aleichem. That's the takeaway. But people often ask those things, and this is one kind of question. What can we learn from Sholem Aleichem's example? What would that mean? Maybe it's this. At any rate, Sholem Aleichem begins to grow up in these environments, but around the time of his young adolescence, he suffers a twin trauma. The first is that his father, who was fairly well-to-do early on in his life, loses a great deal of money. Right, he is cheated out of it by his business partner. And this begins to give Sholem Aleichem an acquaintance with a cycle of doing well, financial security, and financial poverty that will redound for the rest of his life. Secondly, much greater in prominence around the time of his bar mitzvah, he loses his mother. He loses his mother in a cholera epidemic. And his father has children, he has a household to take care of, and so he gets remarried quite quickly, which is the order of the day. And he goes to the big city, to Berdyshev, to find a wife. And he seems to have misrepresented, this is like internet dating, he seems to have misrepresented his financial status. He also, and I don't know how he was going to get away with this, he also misrepresented the number of children he had, apparently. I don't know. He thought he could hide them. I don't know. But suffice it to say that the stepmother comes back, and she is not happy. And not happy. And she does something which I think is quite inexcusable. She takes it out on the children in both physical and verbal abuse. And so it is perhaps, not surprising that in the many, many collected volumes of Sholem Aleichem's work, there is not a single positive depiction of a stepmother. But it is also the case that Sholem Aleichem self-proclaimed first work is an alphabetized collection of his stepmother's curses. And I think everybody knows the juiciness, right, of a Yiddish curse, right? My favorite, they're not really here, but is, right, you should be like sometimes be a chandelier, right? You should be like a chandelier. You should hang by day and burn by night. It's brennen by Nacht, right? But I think that ultimately what happens is, Sholem Aleichem tells a story in his autobiography, and if it's not true, it should be, that he encounters, they're in financial straits, and they ink is expensive, paper is expensive, kerosene, writing at night is very expensive, and so the stepmother finds him writing this late at night, therefore using ink, paper, and kerosene, right? The trifecta. And, he thinks, oh boy, I am in for it now. And she reads it, according to the memoir, she reads it, and she laughs. And she doesn't bother him quite as much from then on. And to me, that sort of seems like Sholem Aleichem's philosophy of Jewish humor in a nutshell, is saying, well, if something bad is happening in your life, historically, writ large historically or personally, you take it and you turn it into writing, you turn it into literature, and you laugh, and it helps a little bit. It doesn't solve the whole situation, right? It doesn't solve the whole situation, but it helps a little bit. And maybe that's all you can ask for sometimes. And that, I think, is something that would stand Sholem Aleichem quite well. It also begins to show, from this early age, Sholem Aleichem's ability to capture the voice, both a male voice and a female voice, in his written work. And just to make sure that we say a Prawer auf Yiddish tonight, a couple of words in Yiddish, I want to read you just 2 sentences from something he wrote later on in 1901. And here are the sentences. Rebbe, ich will euch fragen eine Scheile will ich euch. Ich weiß nicht, sie kennt ihr mich nicht. Ich bin Jente, die Kurlapnischke. Which means, and I will give a literal translation, Rebbe, I want to ask you a ritual question, that's what I want to ask you. I don't know if you know me or if you don't know me. I am Jente the chicken lady. Okay, this is the beginning of a monologue called The Pot, Das Teppel, and this monologue is one of the remarkable evocations that Sholem Aleichem has of, and this is our 4th of 13 ways, talking Yiddish, being a master of talking Yiddish and talking Jewish. Sholem Aleichem loved the monologue. He loved to take people's voices and transform them on the page. And this is a biographer led to a very interesting set of questions for me because, of course, the biography was being written in English. And many of Sholem Aleicham's works as a master of the Yiddish voice with all of its intonations, its verbal tics, that doubling of I am, and those kinds of things, they don't necessarily scan quite as well in English. They're not necessarily supposed to. And how is it that you either privilege or you don't which texts you choose to excerpt, analyze, appear in the book is part of the story of all the millions of decisions you make when you write these books. So, Sholem Aleichem begins to realize that writing at least is something which he is fond of, is something that he is increasingly involved in, but he also realizes that being at home is not a possibility for him. Being in this household under this roof is not a possibility for him. He leaves home. He had hoped to go to university, but for various reasons that you can read about in the book, he is not, it's all available. He is not able to do that, and he ends up becoming a tutor to the daughter of a very successful Eastern European Jewish businessman, Elimelech Loyev. Now, a couple of years later, Sholem Aleichem would write an attack on another kind of Yiddish writer in which he would say, I hate literature that talks about crazy romantic stories like the dashing tutor coming in to the daughter of a wealthy guy, and you see where this is going. And of course, the laughs go round and round because this is exactly what happened. They fall in love. The father finds out. This is, if this sounds like Tevye, you will not be surprised. He finds out he's not so angry that the two of them are together. He's just angry that nobody asked him, right? But he kicks out Sholem Aleichem. They end up eloping. The father takes them in. Sholem bridles underneath his father-in-law's eye. The father-in-law dies of a stroke. And you should excuse the unfortunate stroke, Sholem Aleichem becomes, because of Tsarist inheritance law, one of the wealthiest Jews in Eastern Europe. Now, if this happens to you, let me give you two pieces of advice. I know you did not think you were going to come out of this with practical advice, but I try to provide a service. The first is, if you were going to take all of your money and invest it in the stock market, know what you're doing. See? Helpful. Second is, if you are going to spend a lot of time and effort putting money into trying to publish high-grade anthologies of Yiddish literature, that's great, but please keep an eye on those investments while you're doing it. He did neither of those things, and as a result, he lost all of his money. He had to flee creditors. He had to leave the area to flee creditors. He had to leave the country. He was bailed out by his mother-in-law, who gave him her nest egg to invest. He lost that, with the result that she moved in with them for the rest of her life. Yeah. So, luckily for us, maybe not for him, but luckily for us, he was able to turn this into literature and to create his first great character, this Menachem Mendel. And Menachem Mendel is a kind of a Luftmensch, right, an airman, a failed businessman. And we have him in this voice, right, in letters to his wife, Shana Shandel. And one of the nice things about these, and again, sometimes this is hard to maintain in the English, is that the letters model a kind of formal letter writing style in which the first part, is very formalized and stylized, and then you have the content, and very Hebraic, and then you have the content inside. So Shana Shandel's letters to Menachem Mendel go something like this. To my esteemed husband, Menachem Mendel, may his light shine, may he have an eternal paradise, you're a moron. But, in these letters, you see Sholem Aleichem being someone who is an extremely, if not a canny investor, a canny understanding of the psychology of economics. He really understood the way in which, after his own economic disasters, he understood the way in which overconfidence, ignorance, enthusiasm, optimism can lead to a kind of bubble in which eventually will pop and will lead to a tremendous amount of erosion of net wealth. If this sounds familiar to you, it certainly did to me in 2008 when I started writing the biography. And I think that, again, one of the things we often don't think about is the time, in reading biographies, is the time and place of the biographer, right? So writing this biography, between 2008 and 2012, this was a particular time in which I was very much thinking about these things. They were in the headlines all the time. Maybe if I had written this in 1996, I would have thought very differently about this. I'm not sure, but it allowed me to privilege, and this is, as I said, the fifth way of looking at Sholem Aleichem, as a guide to impractical economic behavior. But it privileges works like one that he wrote in 1894 called Yaknahaz, in which it is about the doings on the Kiev Stock Exchange, and all of these people are buying this kind of equity named Yaknahaz, and no one knows what it is. Nobody knows the internal merits of this, right? And they build it up and up and up and up, and eventually it crashes and what have you. You can replace, Yaknahaz with Theranos, now. For those of you reading the business pages, and right, you have essentially speaking the same story. Now, in 1894, in this Yaknahaz, people tried to ban it. People tried to ban it, particularly Kiev stockbrokers, Jewish Kiev financial people who did not like the way they were portrayed as idiots. And one of the reasons they did this was that, or one of the grounds they tried was they found this guy named Shmuel Pasternak, a character who misquotes the Bible. And they said, this is blasphemy, and it should be banned because it's blasphemous that he misquotes the Bible in these kind of ways. Well, that didn't work, and Sholem Aleichem was able to take that major character in a minor work, and he was able to use that misquoting the Bible, or quoting the Bible and sort of misinterpreting it, in a much more famous character he could create just a couple of years later, and that is, of course, Tevye the dairyman, Tevye the milker. And this leads to our sixth way, right, which is Sholem Aleichem as an inventor of modern Jewish humor, right? We'd already talked about the way in which he uses Jewish comedy and by taking in the Jewish voice. But with Tevye, he's able to harness the voice, right, because Tevye in the original story speaks in monologues, and harness it to questions of theology. Tevye constantly in his monologues, he's addressing, technically speaking, a character, Sholem Aleichem, who he's telling the story to, but he's also often addressing God. And he's saying, you've chosen us, but for this is what you chose. Couldn't you have found somebody else, right? And also, ultimately, he is taking the questions of life and fate of Jewish history, the politics of Jewish history, and tying them in as well. These kinds of things, taking the grand aspects of Jewish life, the quotidian aspects, the national questions of Jewish politics that are going on, and putting them all in a Jewish voice, that's Jewish humor wrapped in a nutshell. And it came very, very importantly to me as I began writing my next book on Jewish comedy, on sale next fall. Sholem Aleichem refracted these questions of the modern Jewish politics through, as many of you know, Tevye's daughters, right? Tevye's daughters very frequently are embodying a certain kind of new movement in the land, whether it's Tzeitl's sort of movement of modernity of wanting to get married because of to her own romantic partner, or whether it's Huddle's sort of involvement with left-wing politics, or Chava's with universalism, right? These political questions are refracted through character involvement, although it's important to point out that essentially we only have Tevye's perspective on them. Tevye quotes his daughters, but all we have is his monologue. But Sholem Aleichem, and this is the seventh way of looking at him, is himself a kind of, or at times was a kind of idealist and a kind of ideologue. He often would take these political questions and put them in less well-known publicistic work through pen and through polemic. The most prominent of these, and the one I want to focus on as an example, is his Zionism. Right, Sholem Aleichem, Eddie was saying that it was very, in our tour, that it is very infrequent that Sholem Aleichem is often thought of as a Zionist, but that is a misthinking, right? That Eddie said he didn't know for a while, and now we know that, right? That his love of the Bible and his love of Hebrew language, which came at a very early age from reading one of the earliest modern Hebrew novels by Avraham Mapu called A Love of Zion, led to a lifelong devotion to the language of Hebrew and to the land of Zion. He participated in Zionist congresses. He raised money for Zionist causes. He gave money. He wrote Zionist pamphlets. Now, I don't want to give you the impression, how could I, that Sholem Aleichem's love of Hebrew had anything to do with his love of Yiddish. Very frequently in Eastern Europe, people wanted to take these as two bifurcated causes, right? If you were for Hebrew, you must be anti-Yiddish, or vice versa. Sholem Aleichem loved them both. And in fact, in this kind of way, he had never read, obviously, The Grapes of Wrath, but he has this line that sounds like kind of a Tom Joad kind of thing. He says, wherever two people are speaking Yiddish, I'll be there. Which is very sweet. It sounds a little creepy, but very sweet. But Sholem Aleichem's own Zionism, his own idealism, or his own ideological perspective, was always tempered with a kind of cynical view of human nature, more precisely Jewish nature. He never actually thought the Jews would be able to stop arguing for long enough in order to get anything done. So I think he would have been delighted beyond all cause to know that, to see a state of Israel in the land of Israel. There's no question about that. He might have been surprised, but he would have been delighted. that illusion, or that thought, I should say, ended up being brought to fruition, although not in his lifetime. But another illusion, or another dream of his, the dream of a kind of Russian-Jewish coexistence, was crushed violently in the years immediately after the first Russian Revolution of 1905. And this leads to another way of looking at Sholem Aleichem, the eighth as a wanderer. Sholem Aleichem sees how that revolution collapses in conservative counter-reaction, and the reaction that blames the Jews, even though there were many individuals involved, the vast majority of them, of course, not Jewish. And he witnesses a series of pogroms from a room up high in Kiev's Hotel Imperial. And he realizes that there is no home for him in Russia, certainly as it stands. And he leaves Russia to find better options abroad, and he will never find his way back permanently again. He requested, though, for his bones to be reinterred he died during the First World War, to be reinterred in Russia. That never happened. He was buried in New York City. But he became, for the rest of his life, a navinod, a wanderer. And he wrote a series of stories in the 20th century that perfectly exhibited this, stories that were set on trains. And Sholem Aleichem stories that were on these trains, some of them which are published in two collections, two bunches, are magnificent for presenting this as a kind of portable home, this train. Possibilities there for disguise and reinvention. Nobody really knows you on a train. You can pretend to be whoever you want to be. And it's a place for storytelling. Sholem Aleichem talks about, or his character, I should say, who is the overarching collector, so to speak, of these stories, says why he likes to travel third class on the train. And he says, well, first class is Gentiles. No. Second class is Jews pretending to be Gentiles. Even worse. Third class, you can take off your shoe, you can relax, you get some good stories going on, right? And so the train becomes a place for, if these reinventions, these masquerades, these disguises are going on, well, those are the things of literature. Those are the things of story. And he is able to get a wide variety of stories out of his wanderings. But whether or not that is what he precisely wanted, right? It's not home. Wandering may have its benefits, nationally, historically, but it's not home, whatever that may end up being. Now, I've been focusing on a lot of aspects about Sholem Aleichem in all sorts of different ways, but there's one in which I want to bring out that is often sort of overlooked in biographies which focus on life, which is simply as a writer's writer. Right? Sholem, right? It's so very easy in sort of telling the story of a person's life to forget the fact that actually when the reason that we like him is not because he led an extraordinary life, but because he wrote extraordinary stories. One of the early, I referred to this briefly, but one of the raps on Sholem Aleichem early on was that he was simply a tape recorder. He did not actually write. And I don't think that is at all fair. What was a fair charge early in his career was that he wrote too quickly, and he wrote too much. Shimon Yankov Abramovich, the great classic Yiddish writer, better known as Mendel HaMelech HaSfarim, accused him or charged him with this in a kind of friendly way, but referring to him as one of the Persian satraps, a word that no one ever reads outside of an English translation of the Megillah, the fleet-footed messengers that go out through all the Persian Empire, right? That he writes and he sends it out, and Sholem Aleichem took that to heart and began to become a very careful editor of his own work, so much so that he would often plague editors with sort of precise revisions and things like that. But he was also a graphomaniac. He would write constantly. He would write all the time. He would carry around these little hand notebooks, and he would sort of scribble on them. And it got to the point where he, of course, began to view his own life, particularly as these years went on and as he was wandering, as he was becoming more successful, that he viewed his life as an experiment in literature. We have letters of his that say, here is this thing that happened to me. And he would write it up, this wonderful letter to someone, and he would say, now make sure a copy of this letter goes to my editor, because I think there's a feuilleton in it. Right? So this often leads to one of the questions of saying with Sholem Aleichem, and this was a question for Biographer, when can we trust the primary sources, forgetting about the literature itself, when can we trust the primary sources of the letters of his life, which often, obviously, are our best source for what he was doing on a particular day at a particular time? Not always, but sometimes. These trips, these train trips, which were such grist for literature, both invented and in his letters and in life, led to another way of him thinking about himself and his audience thinking about him, which was as a celebrity and as a performer. Sholem Aleichem, who was, as a wanderer, he was always broke. He was always looking for money. He had become quite accustomed to a certain lifestyle when he had inherited all that money, and he liked to maintain that lifestyle. He was a bit of a dandy, and he wanted to provide for his children in a similar lifestyle, and that was very difficult. But luckily, perhaps, the increasing explosion of the Yiddish press in the period leading up to that Russian Revolution, the first Russian Revolution, and immediately after, allowed for a much wider audience who were interested in him. Now, widespread intellectual property theft being what it was at the time, the way in which to make money was by touring. And it was, again, interesting to write this book in the age of Napster, and in the age of streaming videos and YouTube clips that don't pay artists any money, and the way in which, let's say, popular culture, producers of popular culture, are often relying on means other than their written work or their musical work in order to make a living, right? In other words, they're creating themselves as a brand rather than as a writer. And Sholem Aleichem, in some ways, continued to crank out this material, both for the certain amount of money that he could get from writing from the press, but also began to perform to raise money for himself and for his family. And some of the things that happen as a result of that, I think, really resonated in the internet era. My favorite of them is he writes to his daughter, and it is the age of photography, right? And an unflattering photograph of his appears in the newspapers. And he says something to his daughter like, "Can't you get it back?" And she has to explain to him that's not how photography works, right? You can't get it back anymore, right, once it's out there. And, when one hears about this in sort of the age of internet celebrity all of the time. That said, these kind of opportunities provided something incredibly valuable, and not to Sholem Aleichem, although they did for him as well. And it comes out in a little feuilleton, I don't think it's been translated, by him called Purchased Eternal Life, I guess you would say, Gekauft Olam Haba. And in this, he is going to give a reading, a public reading. And this woman, this outside, sort of says, "Does anyone have money for a ticket to the reading? I would like to come to the reading. And I don't have any money." And because photography was only in his birthday, she didn't recognize him, according to, as he puts it in the story. And she says, anyone who does this, they will have earned eternal life. Now, Sholem Aleichem has a much more famous story in which that is a much more dicey proposition. But in this one, he gives it to her, and he then meets her afterwards. She sees him afterwards, now, of course, recognizing who was her patron, who was her benefactor. And she gives him a quick kiss on the cheek, and then she disappears. And he realizes that he truly has earned eternal life, not because of the good deed that he has done, right? I think even Sholem Aleichem was not quite that egoistic, but that he was able to provide her the opportunity to participate in a community of people who love and care about Yiddish culture and literature, all coming together in a communal case. This, in some ways, was the kind of transcendent aspect of the cult of literary celebrity that was beginning to impact Yiddish writers, including Sholem Aleichem. Sholem Aleichem writes in his letters about bunches of flowers and numerous ovations, and my personal favorite detail, which is that in one town, they picked him up from the railway station, and the people there who loved him so much, they unharnessed the horses from the carriage. They harnessed themselves to the carriage, and they pulled him directly that way, which no one has ever done for me, I have to say. But, I mean, a Volkswagen, a Buick is much harder to pull, I suppose. But there is that aspect. Now, Sholem Aleichem's touring took rigors on him, and this leads to our 11th way of looking at Sholem Aleichem, and that is as a body in pain. Sholem Aleichem, in Baranovich Station in 1908, after giving a tour, he collapses, he hemorrhages, and he is diagnosed with tuberculosis. He later would write a story, called Stantia Baranovich, that sort of says, Baranovich, why don't you burn to the ground, sort of at the end of it. But the truth is, that's not quite fair to Baranovich. They were very nice to him. They actually, they scattered straw on the stone pavement outside where he was recuperating so that the rattles of the wagon wheels wouldn't disturb him, which, again, no one has ever done for me. This affects the rest of his life. It affects it geographically. He has to spend a lot of his time in various sanatoria that are supposed to help tuberculotic patients. Financially, his medical bills become quite extensive. Familially, he's often separated from his family for times. And of course, psychically. And I think that is the most important thing for a biographer, is that very frequently, in terms of literary biography, we tend to think of people like Sholem Aleichem, our great writers, as almost text-producing machines. And it's very difficult to say, well, this one, I don't know, it's not quite up to his normal standard. Maybe he wasn't feeling well that day. Maybe he had a headache. Maybe these are not perfect icons of literary creativity, but they are human beings with all that afflicts and assails them. And that's something that I intellectually we know to keep in mind, but it's something that is sort of hard to keep track of sometimes all the way through writing a work of a person's life. Sholem Aleichem's comfort in his illness, as it was his comfort in much of his life, was his family. This is the 12th way of looking at Sholem Aleichem as a family man. If pain is something which takes you into yourself, it makes you center and focus on yourself. Family, the love of family, is something that takes you out of yourself, that centers yourself out. And one of the questions that I was sometimes asked when I would tell some of the story of Sholem Aleichem to people was, at the beginning part, they would say, oh, well, he married the daughter of the wealthy landowner. Well, I can see why that happened. But the truth is that would not be fair to Sholem Aleichem at all. It would be a canard. He loved his wife very, very deeply. He seems to have loved, to have had a wildly romantic relationship with her through his life. And she really comes into her own in sort of pugnaciously and ferociously defending some of the finances around him when he is sort of incapable of doing that himself because of illness. He loves his children to distraction. He loves his children. And as time goes on, it pains him greatly to be separated from them when he is. And when they can all be together, especially as they grow older and they're married and they go off to raise families in other places, the family reunions are a great joy. Again, there are letters that you read that sound uncannily like letters I get from my family, from my parents, which say, well, is everyone going to be able to get together for Seder this year? And you say, this is a person who you can recognize. That family was together, or most of them were together in a German resort in Albeck on the coast of the Baltic Sea when the First World War breaks out. Being Russian nationals, as the family was in Germany when World War I breaks out, is not an optimal situation, and they begin to escape. They go through mine-infested waters. They make their way to Copenhagen, and it is there that, in one of the great tragedies of Sholem Aleichem's life, takes place. His oldest son, Misha, develops tuberculosis, or has developed tuberculosis as well, and he is incapable of continuing going on with the family to America. Sholem Aleichem arrives there. He settles in. He waits for his son to come. He waits. His son is supposed to come on a ship. He goes to the docks. He waits for him. His son has not arrived. He returns home to receive a telegram that his oldest son has died in Copenhagen. And that is the day that Sholem Aleichem sits down and makes his will and writes the epitaph that is available to be seen in its original version upstairs here at YIVO. This leads to our 13th way of looking at Sholem Aleichem, which is as a ghost and as a presence. I use that term advisedly. The last term, 45 years ago in YIVO in 1972, Don Miron, in a memorial lecture, this one for Uriel Weinreich, referred to Sholem Aleichem as a presence. Not a person, not a persona, but a presence. Now there, as a term of art in the scholarship around Sholem Aleichem, he's referring to a textual presence. You may recall that I briefly said that Tevye speaks to Sholem Aleichem. And so, of course, it's not Sholem Aleichem, but Sholem Aleichem, which is only part of the game playing, right? We haven't talked about Sholem Nachumovich Rabinovich and how he becomes Sholem Aleichem and all that. We just don't have time for everything. But we can think of Sholem Aleichem almost half a century later as another kind of presence, another kind of ghost. After his death in America, his family takes that will that he wrote, and they present it both in all of the Yiddish newspapers, but they also present it in English translation immediately to the American public. And the New York Times has, with their perspicacious journalistic instincts, have noticed the 200,000 people gathering in New York City and wanted to sort of know what this was about. And so they publish this public ethical will that Sholem Aleichem has. And it is read on the floor of the Congressional Record. To the best of my knowledge, the only will by a Yiddish writer to be read on the floor of the House of Representatives. I'm still sure they didn't have C-SPAN there. I'm still sure no one was there. But nonetheless, it has been entered into the Congressional Record. And people in a wider circle, or a circle more precisely that is not necessarily Yiddish-oriented, begin to become aware of Sholem Aleichem. And at first, in those years, in those teens, in the 20s, even into the 30s, Sholem Aleichem is known primarily as a writer of children's stories. Not a writer for children. That's not quite correct. But a writer of children's stories. And in many ways, that model befits a certain kind of look at an American Jewish presence that Sholem Aleichem is presiding over. He, as an immigrant of a middle age, might not be capable of adapting to the new world. But Muttel, his great child character, Muttel, the cantor's son, he himself moves to America, and as a small child will be able to become a very different kind of American Jew than Sholem Aleichem himself is, if that term at all fits. That was, as I say, in the teens, and the 20s, and the 30s. But after the war, the history of Sholem Aleichem's presence takes a very different turn. And not surprisingly, perhaps, stories that Sholem Aleichem write about the old country, in the title of an anthology and translation of his stories that is on the New York Times bestseller list, those become the locus of Sholem Aleichem, of interest in Sholem Aleichem. And in those stories, one representative exemplar, or so it is presented, of the old country stands out. And thus, Tevye makes his appearance of increasing prominence in the American and American Jewish imagination. Very frequently, I'm asked, what would Sholem Aleichem make of Fiddler on the Roof? Right? This is a very frequent question. And my response is always the same. He would love more royalties. But on one hand, I would say, but then, more precisely, and I owe this esteemed crowd a more nuanced response, I think, on one level, I think he would have resonated with and he would have admired the way in which it presents a world, even if it's a world of the shtetl, right? A world that's changing and dynamic, that mixes comic and tragic in various portions. But I think he might in some ways have bridled at a model where, even with the ending that Fiddler on the Roof has, but of leaving with a song in your heart and an 11 o'clock number. Sholem Aleichem famously in the community of people who study him and read him, hated closure in his short stories. He hated to give an ending. Now, sometimes he did that just to mess with readers' minds, I have to be honest. And if I wanted to mess with your minds, I would just walk out right now. But I like to think that one of the many reasons why he did not always end his stories or his works was because he wanted to see what would happen next. He wanted to learn more, and he wanted other people to learn more. He was terrified of a rise of ignorance of culture and history among a new Jewish population that he saw coming. He wrote two versions of a Manishtana, of a Firkashius, of a boy who would say, in these cases, would charge his parents with saying, in the American version, why are you insisting that we learn about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, but that we learn nothing about Judah Maccabee and King David? Right? He has a story, a more pointed satire called Was is Hanukkah, What is Hanukkah, in which he's had a big party in one of the big cities of the Tsarist Empire, and sort of has a bet that nobody, even though it's a Hanukkah party, that no one will actually remember what Hanukkah is about. And you wouldn't want to take that bet, basically, is the point of the story. So, Sholem Aleichem's stories that don't end are in some ways an invitation. They're an invitation for his readers and those who care about him and all of us to explore more deeply the treasures of Eastern European, Jewish, and Yiddish culture. This is a challenge that has been taken up so powerfully by the Naomi Foundation and by YIVO. This, in some sense, these institutions would be the prime cherished inheritors of the legacy that he created. I'm honored to be able to contribute in some small part to the work of both of them. Thank you all very much for your attention.